Now, the very first thing I gotta say here is that this show better be getting a third season, because the way this season finale played out, the way it left us hanging, has left me not just wanting more, but needing more of this show. And sure, there may have been some less than stellar episodes along the way during the season, but when this show is good, it is really good, if not just plain excellent. And this finale was no exception to that. This finale was fantastic. This is how you wrap up a season, even though that was about the last thing I ever expected to happen. I mean, yeah, I thought maybe we might lose a core team member, but I really thought the whole Crosshair thing would end up getting resolved one way or another, with him either rejoining the team after being rescued, or maybe being that aforementioned team member who perishes in his own rescue. Though I also thought another team member could die during the rescue and Crosshair would live and rejoin the team, which would lead to some, shall we say, extra tension next season between the Bad Batch. Either way, I thought for sure with almost absolute certainty that's how this season would end, with the rescue or death of Crosshair. Seemed pretty straightforward and simple and very likely. And for a while there, or at the start, that's exactly how it looked like things were going to play out. We see at the beginning of the first episode, they're coming up with a plan to essentially track Dr. Hemlock back to his secret lair, so they could then go and rescue Crosshair from wherever that ended up being. And at this point I'm thinking, okay, the first episode will be that plan, more or less going off without a hitch or maybe a minor problem, before they discover it's on Mount Tantus, that's where the base is, that's where Crosshair is, and in the second episode, that's where they go. That's where things will probably start to go wrong, and we'll have both tragedy and victory in the end to wrap up the season, or the classic bittersweet Star Wars ending where the good guys win, but it comes at a cost. But nope, that's not how it happened at all, which at first seemed like it was going to be a bit disappointing. It felt like, again, the whole season had been building or leading to the rescue attempt of Crosshair, like it was just a given. And so when the first episode ended and our heroes were stuck on a rail car, I was thinking to myself, okay, so we're not making it to Mount Tantus, are we? Instead, the finale is just going to be them escaping from Eriadu or Eriadu, or however it's pronounced. Which again was kind of disappointing. I didn't see how this was going to end in a way that would be worthy of a finale or satisfying if it didn't involve the big reunion with Crosshair, whatever that might end up looking like. But then Tech needed to go out and be the one to restore power to the rail car, and I suddenly remembered who was, in a sense, the deciding vote to even attempt this mission in the first place. Because if we go back to the beginning of that first episode again, it starts with coming up with this plan to track Hemlock's ship from a high-ranking Imperial meeting on Eriadu back to wherever Hemlock was going to do his cloning stuff, and where, in theory, Crosshair should be. And though Hunter is arguing against the mission or taking the risk, it's Tech who then says that they may not have always agreed with Crosshair, but he is still their brother, and they don't leave their own behind. Which is when I realized that the Tech of old, or the one from before this season, he likely looks at things differently with his usual very analytical mind and agrees it's not worth the risk, and that's that. But not this new Tech, not the one these evil and devious writers have spent plenty of time this season developing as a character that we'd start to truly care about. No, this Tech would look at the situation differently now. He'd see beyond the numbers and finally make a decision with his heart instead of his head, and it would of course cost him everything because that's what evil writers do. And I mean, when you then factor in that perfectly awkward goodbye he had with Fee before leaving, well, I knew with almost absolute certainty, not that that means anything in this episode, but I knew that his fate was sealed and I started to prepare myself for his death. However, and maybe in large part to, once again, Kevin Kiner's brilliant score, or maybe because of Tech saying, "When have we ever followed orders?" which was so sadly brilliant, if that makes sense. But I wasn't prepared enough because, damn, that really hit me a lot harder than I thought it would, and especially a lot harder than I thought it would before this season ever began. If you would have told me a couple months ago that Tech was going to die, I would have shrugged and said, well, about time someone on this team dies. It was then also in this moment when I realized that maybe Echo isn't my favorite member of the Bad Batch, or maybe he isn't anymore. That maybe Tech instead is, or was, though that said, this is Star Wars, and yep, no one is ever really gone, especially when they fall a great distance. Falling damage in Star Wars is not a thing. And unless you literally see someone die in Star Wars, and sometimes even when you do, they could always come back. Dr. Hemlock even had Tech's goggles, which, though it convinced Hunter that Tech is as good as dead, it kind of did the opposite for me. It just made me think the Empire is going to have him locked up in Mount Tantus now. Anyway, though I like Tech, though he might just be my favorite, and though I'll miss him in that third season we absolutely need to get, and that I hope gets announced at Celebration in a week or so, I do not want him to come back. Please let someone in Star Wars just be dead for good. Moving on here, or going backwards a bit, a big part of the reason why the plan to track Hemlock's ship went south is because of Saw Gerrera. He was a surprise to be sure, but an unwelcome one in this case considering the eventual outcome. And though at times the Bad Batch have their weapons set to stun, Saw never ever does that, and he was there to do little more than blow up some high-ranking Imperials that were there for a meeting. Among them, of course, being Tarkin, as well as Director, though currently Commander Krennic, who we of course first see in Rogue One, though technically first see him in the book Catalyst, which is a fantastic read, brought to us by the great James Luceno. It is easily one of the best books in the new canon, in my opinion. Anyway, at this meeting we learn that what Dr. Hemlock is trying to do is unlock all the secrets of cloning that the Kaminoans discovered. He is interested in molecular alteration, and all of this is of great importance to Palpatine. Can't imagine why, not like he's going to die someday and need a clone body. And yes, it also seems to very much align with what Dr. Pershing was up to, but that is all, I think, a discussion for another time as to what exactly is going on with all of this cloning. Another thing I found interesting about this meeting is Tarkin mentioning how he too served with the clones during the Clone War, and that he found the individuality they developed under the Jedi to be concerning. Basically, he hates what we fans all loved about the Clone Wars, which is how it turned the clones into actual people or actual characters. And once again here, Hemlock talks about how the clones, are little more than property of the Empire and don't have a say in what happens to them next. And speaking of next, let's now move forward again to after the tragic death of Tech and to after the railcar crashes and we see Omega is severely wounded, which leads the team back to Ord Mantell and to Sid's place because they needed the droid AZ to help save her. And this was not the smartest move on their part, and I do question a bit if they would be foolish enough to not realize how likely it was for Sid to betray them. I mean, she basically said she was gonna do it. And sure, they are younger than they look, and maybe, just maybe, still a bit naive when it comes to people, though you'd think they'd have enough experience out in the galaxy at this point, out on their own, to be a little less trusting. And don't get me wrong here, it by no means ruins the finale, not even close to that. But it did seem a little odd that they didn't really think twice about taking Omega to Sid's because they needed AZ. I mean, is there no doctor on Pabu at all? Echo has a contact who knows where high-ranking Imperials are meeting, and maybe it's the same one Saw had, but he doesn't know anyone who can treat some wounds? Heck, you'd almost think the Underground Clone Network would have a medic among their ranks of some kind. But letting that go, Sid does indeed betray them to the Empire, which was great, actually. I'm glad that all of that setup and signs pointing to this happening wasn't all for naught. That despite all they did for her, it was indeed her being the out-for-herself snitch I wanted her to be all along, because not everyone needs to have the proverbial heart of gold underneath a rough exterior. Some people just suck. And so Hemlock and his commandos show up, and after a chase and a pretty cool battle sequence overall, they, or should I say, our boy Scorch, they end up capturing Omega. But the rest of the Bad Batch ultimately make their getaway, in part because of some really poor aim out of some clone commandos who missed at essentially point-blank range. That was my other kind of minor nitpick that I'm more than happy to let go because of just how good this was otherwise. Plus, for every overtly silly thing like that, there is at least one very awesome, subtle detail put in there that more than makes up for it. This week there was this kind of blink and you'll miss it moment where Echo, at the end when he's piloting the Marauder, he turns his head and he looks at the empty seat Tech usually sits in, and you can see and feel the sadness. It was just perfect. And speaking of Tech being the pilot, it does seem like there was a very good reason why Omega was taking flying lessons in the previous episode. That was a bit of foreshadowing. And I'm still expecting her to use the Tech turn in the not too distant future. probably during their escape from Mount Tantus, which is maybe how Season 3 will start, assuming we do indeed get that third season, which no, has not been confirmed. But again, Celebration is like a week away, and that feels like the perfect time to confirm it. But before even speculating about a third season, which may not happen, we have heard a lot about Disney cutting back. Anyway, we have to briefly talk about the very end of this finale, the last big, not too shocking reveal that I think a lot of us maybe kind of guessed at, which is that the assistants of Hemlock are actually clones of Omega, or should I say Jango Fett clones who look like Omega, or look like what she'll look like when she grows up. Again, that was kind of predicted, but I'm not entirely sure what that ultimately means. What is their purpose, or who or why created them and when? I mean, I'm assuming accelerated aging was used on them, otherwise they shouldn't be that old. But as for what end, I guess we'll kind of have to wait and see on that one. As well as have to wait and see how Omega is rescued and what ultimately happens to Crosshair, not to mention all the other clones, meaning there is plenty yet to come, hopefully, from the Bad Batch series. And so in closing here, though not what I expected out of the finale pretty much at all, I'm not disappointed by it. In fact, it left me appreciating what was a very good season overall, actually. One I'll be discussing further in a Let's Talk Some Star Wars video probably sometime this weekend, and a poll asking what you thought of this season is already up, and a link to it can be found in the description below, should you want to partake. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought of this finale. Or you can seek out that poll and vote, or respond to it and tell me what you thought of the season on the whole. Whatever you choose to do, leave a comment somewhere and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.